Welcome back. This is going to be screencast number 1 for chapter 6, and I have chosen to actually tie together 6.1 and 6.2 into the same screencast. And as I do this, that's probably going to mean that this screencast is going to be a little bit longer than some of the screencasts that we have seen before. But it's a really important screencast because we're going to look at how society and the economy play a huge role in the different ways that we actually treat our environment. Now, before we can start talking about things such as that, we need to make sure we have a good working vocabulary when it comes down to talking about our environment and how humans have actually impacted that. So we want to look at the idea of natural resources and how humans have actually used those natural resources over many years. Now, there's actually two different types of resources. We have one that's called a renewable resource, and we have one that's called a non-renewable resource. Now, if you identify something as being a renewable resource, we're talking about a resource that can actually be regenerated, it could be regrown, or it can be replaced. So it's never really gone. And some good examples of that would be water. Air would be a good example of a renewable resource. The soil, of course. Trees, a good example of a renewable resource. And the sunlight. Now, if it's considered a non-renewable resource, these are resources that unfortunately cannot be replenished or replaced by any type of natural process because it's taken millions and millions of years for these different resources to form. And good examples of a non-renewable resource would be things like oil, coal, natural gas is an example of a non-renewable resource, and old growth trees. And so these would be trees that have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And a lot of times if you cut these trees down, it's really hard for them to recover. Now, of course, when you talk about resources, we often hear the term sustainable. And when you're talking about a sustainable use of these resources, we're making sure that however we do decide to use the resources, we want to make sure that we use these resources at a rate that does not deplete them. In other words, it doesn't cause them to be gone really quickly because, of course, if we take away these resources too fast, it's going to be hard for them to recover. Now, some good examples of what we would consider a sustainable use of these different types of resources. Number one being reusing paper and plastic supplies. That would be one. Recycling paper, plastics, and metals, which I'm sure a lot of us do, would be another example. Using solar or wind power for electricity, biking or walking. Definitely buying locally grown foods and other local products. Upgrade electronic devices less often and recycle your phone. Even turning off the water while you brush your teeth. So as we make our way through these three different types of resources, what we're going to do is we're going to break them down into three major categories. The first one being the soil, the second being the water, and the third is going to be the air. Now when we talk about the soil, sometimes it's really hard for us to understand how important the soil really is. Sometimes we don't even realize how we actually use the soil. Definitely in order to grow food, this would be something that the soil is necessary for it because it provides a lot of minerals for those plants to be able to grow. If you think about the wood that is used for construction, definitely had a soil component, and even the paper that you write on in class definitely needed the soil in order to be there for you to be able to use. Now, healthy soil supports agriculture and forests, and so it's really important that we make sure we do really good things to make sure that soil stays healthy. A good topsoil is going to be one that actually allows the water to drain and retain moisture. And so if you look over here on the right, you're going to notice we have a diagram of different layers of soil. And the way that these layers interact with each other is very important to the plants that you see on the surface. And so if you have a good topsoil that's going to allow water to drain down, it's going to prevent these roots that you see right here from getting really waterlogged or soaked, which can definitely have a huge impact on whether or not these plants that you see on the surface are going to remain healthy. Now, as we had said, the topsoil is considered a renewable resource, but you need to make sure that you manage that soil properly because if you don't, you definitely can damage it or you could lose the soil altogether. Now we need to consider the threats to soil resources, and one of those threats is something called soil erosion. Now when you see the word erosion, what you need to be thinking about is the movement of something. If something is eroded away, it's usually removed. And when you talk about soil erosion, you're talking about the movement of the soil either by wind or by water. Now soil erosion is often worse when the land is being plowed and being left barren between plantings or between crops. Now when the soil is eroded, you need to imagine that a lot of that organic matter and minerals that are really important to those plants are often being carried away with the soil. Now, One of the words we often associate with soil erosion is something called desertification. It's actually the result, the severe result of extreme soil erosion. And this often turns fertile lands into deserts. And this is actually what happened in the Great Plains in the middle of the United States during the 1930s. In fact, some of you might recognize that as being the Dust Bowl. Now over here on the right we have a map that is illustrating the different areas in North and South America that are being subjected to extreme desertification or soil erosion. Any areas that you see in red, and you can see quite a few of these in the western United States, actually have a very high likelihood of extreme erosion occurring or desertification occurring. Anywhere that you see green is going to have a very low incidence of erosion or desertification. And so it's definitely something that we need to be concerned about in our own country. So another thing that we need to consider when it comes down to soil resources is the idea of deforestation. Now, when you deforest something, you basically remove something. So in this case, you're removing all of the trees from the land. And usually we remove the trees as a result of either logging, different forms of agriculture, and possibly to make the area available for grazing for other animals. In less than 40 years, we have destroyed almost 50% of our tropical forest as a result of deforestation. Now, what are some of the effects of deforestation? As we had said before, severe soil erosion, especially when it comes down to mountainsides, because the trees work really hard to keep that soil in place. Decreased rainfall and soil fertility is another effect of deforestation. A decrease in oxygen, because we all know that, of course, plants are going to produce oxygen, and an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because we no longer have those trees removing the carbon dioxide to be used for photosynthesis. And then, of course, without the trees, we lose a lot of the habitat that is available for wildlife. So what are some things that we can actually do to help preserve a lot of the soil that we have on this planet? Well, the first thing we can do is we can leave stems and roots from the previous year's crop in the ground, or what you could actually do is you can actually grow what we consider a cover crop to help keep the soil in place. Another good thing to do would be that if you're a farmer, try to rotate crops each year so you can help the soil become even more healthy, because different types of plants take different types of nutrients from the soil. Only harvest some of the mature trees in the forest. In other words, leave some of the trees there so they can help to maintain that soil. And definitely protect the quality of the soil by limiting pollution and the use of any types of chemicals that you might use in that area. Because remember, if you use chemicals on the soil, for example, if you use some sort of pesticide or herbicide, that actually can leach into the soil and can remain in the soil for a very long period of time. And of course, that's going to be taken up by the wildlife, then of course taken up by the plants that might inhabit that area. As I had said, there's going to be three areas that we were going to focus on. The first one being soil. The second one is going to be water. Now, of course, we all know that water is extremely important to all living things. Something we may not understand is that fresh water is actually very limited on our planet. I mean, we of course need water for drinking, and of course we like to use water for various different types of other things like recreation, industry, transportation, energy, and waste disposal. But really, if you think about it, there's only about 3% of the Earth's water that is actually considered fresh. In fact, most of it is going to be locked in ice at the poles. And so a lot of that 3% we cannot even get to. So over here on the right, this kind of gives you a good idea of the water and where it's actually placed on Earth. So if you notice, again, as we had said, only about 3% of that water is going to be fresh water. If you look at the graph in the middle, groundwater makes up about 30.1% of that fresh water. A lot of that fresh water is going to be locked in ice caps and glaciers. And if you look at the water on the surface, of the fresh water, 87% is going to be found in the lakes, about 11% in swamps, then the rest of it is going to be found in the rivers on our planet. So again, when it comes down to the water we can actually use, we are very, very limited. Now, understanding how important water is to us on this planet, we need to make sure that we consider the different threats that we have to our water resources. And one of the primary threats that we have is the actual burning of fossil fuels. Now, what that does is it actually releases nitrogen and sulfur compounds into the air. So when you have various industry, transportation, any type of electricity generating plants, what they do is they release these nitrogen and sulfur compounds into the air. These compounds are going to combine with the water vapor in the air, and they form something called acid rain. Now, acid rain is a little bit different from normal rain because instead of having a pH of 4 to 6, the pH of acid rain is actually from about 1 to 3 on that pH scale, so it's extremely acidic. And when you have acid rain, of course, any living thing that needs to use that water, that rain, is going to be affected. And a lot of times, because the pH is so low, it tends to destroy a lot of the plant life on our planet. So we see a huge increase in the destruction of forests. Of course, animals are greatly affected as well, especially the fish population that we have on this planet because they are in direct contact with that water. So it causes, unfortunately, a lot of these animals to die. So, of course, changes in the water pH are also going to have a direct effect in the pH of various soils as well. And so all of this combined together makes it very difficult for various organisms like animals and plants to be able to survive on our planet. One of the biggest things we can do to help to keep our water clean is to protect our natural water filters. Now, a good example of this would be all of the water that we have on this planet probably at one point or another is going to travel through a wetland of some sort and probably travel underground as well. And when it does these two things, what it does is it actually helps to filter out or actually remove any excess nutrients or certain pollutants that might be in that water. In fact, as the water travels through the wetlands, we have certain species of plants which are going to work to actually take those excess nutrients and pollutants out. And if you can take these things out of the water, it actually secondarily helps to keep our soils clean as well. So the third thing we need to look at is the atmosphere or the air and how important it is to living things on this planet. For most of the Earth's history, the quality of the Earth's atmosphere has been naturally maintained by the Earth's cycle of matter. So everything that you had learned in section 3.4 about the carbon cycle and especially the water cycle has helped to maintain the quality of our air. But unfortunately, when you disrupt these cycles, then what we do is we tend to overload the atmosphere with pollutants, and the effects on its quality can last a very, very long time. Now, one of the big things that we rely on when it comes down to having a good quality of air is we want to make sure that we have plenty of oxygen to breathe. Now, not only do we need it to respire or to stay alive, but we also need that oxygen when it comes down to things like cell respiration, which is something we had talked about back in Chapter 9. The idea that oxygen is necessary for us to be able to break down our food and for our cells to be able to use the nutrients found in that food. So the quality of our atmosphere has a direct effect on our health overall. Now, one of the things that we often talk about when it comes down to the atmosphere or the air is the amount of ozone that we find in that atmosphere. Now, ozone is simply a form of oxygen. Now, ozone becomes really important because what it does for us is it actually absorbs a lot of the harmful ultraviolet radiation that is being produced from the sun. And as we all know, if you take away the protection from that UV radiation, then it's going to open us up more for different types of health problems. One of the primary ones being damage to our skin, because as we know, if you stay out in the sun too long, it can cause skin cancer. And so that ozone is very important to make sure that we have that protection from those UV rays. So one of the big threats to our air resources is ozone depletion. And there are various different human activities that are to blame when it comes down to actually removing that layer of ozone gas in our atmosphere. Now, the unfortunate thing is, you remove the layer of ozone, remember it's going to open us up to the sun's more harmful UV rays. Now, ozone depletion is caused primarily by chemicals. For example, chemicals that you might find in aerosol cans, plastic foams like styrofoam, and lots of refrigeration coolants. And so these unfortunately will work to deplete the ozone that is protecting us from those UV rays. And it does tend to cause holes in our atmosphere. So over here on the right you can see a diagram that shows a progression from September 1981 through September of 1999. And this is going to be the ozone layer in our atmosphere. And if you notice as we progress across and down, that ozone layer is getting thinner and thinner. And when it gets darker blue, basically it means that there's more UV radiation coming through that atmosphere. Now, what are some effects of ozone depletion? Well, when you don't have the ozone, of course, you're going to see an increase in global temperatures because it typically means you have an increase in greenhouse gases. Now, often when you think about the atmosphere, you often think about the greenhouse effect. Now, the greenhouse effect is something that's actually really important to our planet because without the greenhouse effect, our planet would be extremely cold. So the gases that we find in our atmosphere actually work to trap heat and energy and help maintain the Earth's temperature range. In fact, without the gases, our Earth would be about 30 degrees Celsius cooler than it is today. Now, as we had done with the previous two categories, we also need to consider some threats to air resources. Now, I had just mentioned that the greenhouse effect is very important when it comes down to keeping our planet warm. The unfortunate thing is because we are releasing a lot of what we consider greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, those would be things like CO2 and carbon monoxide, more heat is being trapped in our atmosphere than it was before, and a lot of that extra gas is causing an increase in the average global temperature. Now, this increase in temperature oftentimes will have a secondary effect, which means that you will often see a rise in sea levels. You will see more frequent severe storms and weather disturbances on the planet, more frequent droughts and floods, and changes in geographic distribution of species. Basically, meaning that any animal that can't adapt to the change in temperature is going to definitely do its best to find another area to live. Now, over here on the right, you can see global average temperature and carbon dioxide concentrations from 1880 to 2004. And it's pretty apparent that as you look at the CO2 concentration, which is going to be this line right here, you can notice that as the concentration of CO2 increases, the temperature itself, even though it tends to fluctuate up and down, is overall tending to increase as well. So the correlation between these two things seems to indicate that the greenhouse effect, global warming, is actually taking place. Now, another thing we need to think about when it comes down to air resources, in addition to some of the things we had talked about previously, is the idea of direct air pollution, one of these things being smog. Now, we had talked about the idea that there are some different types of industries, some things that we might do that actually increase the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere. But there's also other chemicals that we also put into our atmosphere that definitely cause us many health concerns. And you often notice that these chemicals are in the atmosphere because they cause sort of a gray-brown or a hazy appearance in the sky. It's been estimated that the U.S. alone will release 700,000 tons of air pollutants each day into our atmosphere. So what are some things that we can do to actually improve air quality? Well, around here in Oregon, where we use lots of wood stoves in our homes, we can make sure that we use a wood stove that is certified by Oregon. And so what that means is that we have a wood stove that's going to add less particulates in the air. Now, particulate is a little piece of maybe ash or wood that's being burned by that wood stove, but it becomes airborne and basically just kind of floats around in the air, and it kind of causes some of the haze that we sometimes notice in the wintertime. Composting of leaves instead of burning them would be an important thing we can do because, of course, when you burn them, you introduce those particulates also into the air. Planting trees and other plants, of course, are going to help to filter the air, help to filter out some of the pollutants that we might experience in our atmosphere. Driving a vehicle that uses less fuel, or maybe driving an electric vehicle, less CO2 into the air, less pollutants into the air, or better yet, maybe biking or walking. Keeping our homes insulated so that you save energy on heating and cooling. So again, less of those refrigerants, those different types of chemicals you might introduce into our atmosphere, and using organic fertilizers in our yard. Because remember, chemical fertilizers definitely pollute the air and the water. So that's going to finish up our very first screencast for Chapter 6. Unfortunately, this was a long one, but please make sure that you've completed your screencast notes before you come to class.